What if the United States went full Imperial? That is the question I will try to answer today. We will start with the American Revolution. I will start off this scenario with one huge change. In the days where they were first building an American identity, they would, instead of wanting a presidential system, they would want a full-on monarchy system. I know this is a huge reach, but this is what we will be going with for the sake of this scenario. The American War for Independence would go better than in our own timeline. The reason being is that the monarch fanboys up in the north would be or could be convinced that this is for the greater good. Now for the historical tidbit. The colonies that would now make up New Brunswick and Nova Scotia were considering joining the Union in the rebellion, but they decided to stay loyal. But with this new monarchy about to be installed into North America, I feel like they would just join in. The British could not do anything because in this timeline, the whole of British North America is rebelling. Long story short, the British had nowhere to land or to invade from, so they lost the war within a couple of years. This will make the United States of America large upon independence. Now to describe the alternate government in this timeline. George Washington, instead of being a president, is now the King of the United States of America, and any democratic representation will be thrown out the window. But he will still have a cabinet, as he would need people close to him when he's governing. It will become up until the American-Algerian War in 1785. Now, with a stronger America, I believe they would win this war, but they would get nothing from it, other than a good military track record. But now we have a major problem. George Washington is now 66 years old, and he doesn't have an heir. He had 0 kids in our own timeline, and I doubt that would change here. This would cause a huge trouble in the country, with the major question being, who will be the new king? This question is super hard to answer because his siblings would also be old or dead. But I will do a wild card. I will say that in the Constitution it would say, if one cannot find an heir, the closest member in cabinet would thus become the crown. So, now, who is George Washington's closest? The answer is not Thomas Jefferson, although it could be different in this timeline, but the real answer is John Adams. Now, for those doubting why not Thomas Jefferson, he was kind of mad at George Washington in our own timeline, so I doubt that in this timeline it would be much different. So when George died at the end of 1799, the new king would be John Adams. So he would still fight the quasi-war, as the French are still attacking American ships, so war it is. I feel like this could open up better relations with the States and Britain, although it would still need a lot more before they fully trust each other. At the end of the quasi-war, we will have it be an American victory, and it makes France pay some reparations to the Americans, as well as giving them Hispaniola, which would be debated on whether France owns all of it or if Spain has some of it. Either way, it would all be going to the Americans. And also French Guinea goes to the Americans, or French Guyana, however it's pronounced or said. Now, with Napoleon being a wacky fella, you can never really tell what he's going to do. But personally, I think he wouldn't care as he is more European focused anyways. So he would let the Americans have Louisiana the same as in our time. Now we cross into the 1800s, and in time for the First Barbary War, they would whoop the Ottomans and Moroccans so hard they would give up land to the Kingdom of Sicily. Now here is where peace sets in. For a whole decade, the states would do nothing war-related. Besides for the small-scale native repressing that always happens. The War of 1812 won't happen, so naturally we have to move on to the Second Barbary War. Again, that would result in a huge US victory, but nothing would be gained. But just 2 years later, we had the First Seminole War. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Where the US gained Florida and Cuba from the Spanish. Here is where the debate goes in. If Hispaniola was part Spanish, then they would definitely get it by now. But on the 4th of July in 1826, John Adams would die. So who is the new king? Unlike Washington, Adams could actually poll, so we had children. For simplicity's sake, we will say John Quincy Adams is now in charge. If you're a history buff, John Quincy Adams was the 6th president of the United States. So we have 3 presidents already that were the same in our timeline. Instead of being 6th president, he would be 3rd king. There'd be not much war up until the Mexican-American War. The American troops would push in and push hard, but the Mexicans would also fight hard. Then the Americans would do a naval invasion which captures Mexico City and eventually ends the war. Now in our timeline, when deciding a peace deal, they were split. Some people wanted all of Mexico, but others just wanted the North. But in this timeline, they would take all of Mexico, making the states around 13 million miles in size. This would be absolutely huge, but John Quincy would soon die, and the new king is Charles Adam, and he would be making the most important decision in U.S. history. With the new Mexican land, should we A. treat them like losers because they lost the war, or B. treat them like Americans because they have just been annexed and their ethnicity doesn't matter? I feel like although we don't know much about this man, I feel like B would be the option chosen, which seems fine to me. I don't see much going wrong, because they already annexed Cuba and Florida from the Spanish. Now we have the usual crushing natives happening for a few decades. None of that will change, as the Americans still won't get along with the natives. But now we get onto the event known as Bleeding Kansas. This is where people flooded in to vote on whether Kansas should be a free state or not. These people got really mad, and some crazy stuff happened, which is why it is called Bleeding Kansas, as violence occurred. Kansas eventually went on to become a free state, and not a slave state. Now we will have the Second Opium War happen, where the Qing got beaten by Europeans and Americans, and everybody from everywhere basically got a chunk in this. But nothing too big would happen there. Now in Mexico, we will have some conflict happening. A civil war will break out earlier than in our timeline, and Mexico is included. This is based off of a Mexican civil war in our timeline, so that's why the date is earlier. So who would win this different civil war? The population would be close, but since the North has more industry than the South, I feel like the North would win the Civil War. Charles would die in 1886 and would be replaced with John Quincy II, who would die just 8 years later, and would be replaced with Charles III. Man, these presidents died very fast there. But back when the Civil War was ongoing, the British would offer help, but only if Charles would get married to British royalty, and he would accept. So from the Civil War onwards, the United States and the British would be allies. In 1898, the United States would annex the Philippines from the Spanish for $20 million, which is really cheap. But this would come with some trouble, as rebellions would have to be put down, but it's nothing to worry about. But now Charles III has a crazy idea. What if we annex Central America? Now, for some people doubting whether they would actually do this, know that in our timeline they really love the banana republics, so it's not completely out of idea. Of course, besides the British colonies, which would be kept the same. So down the American troops go, and in less than a year, the Americans own the new Panama Canal. But here is the question. Would the US still be dragged into World War I? I would say yes, because they are allies with the British. After all, so they would have to join in and crush the Germans. The only major change would being the states would install a different German monarch to the new German throne and form the new Kingdom of Germany. They would still be involved in the Russian Civil War and would crush the communists and redo the new Russian government. Tsar Nicholas would be installed in the new Kingdom of Russia. So we have 2 states, 2 new kingdoms. Pretty cool. But now we have the Great Depression, which would stay the same and would end in 1941. But now with the new Kingdom of Germany, this raises a question. Would World War II still happen? I would have to say yes, actually, because just because it is a kingdom doesn't mean it still won't be mad. So the states would rush through, and in the new peace deal, Germany would be smaller, and a new monarch would be put in charge. Now this would leave us with one last major question. Would the Cold War still happen, and maybe in a different form? My answer is going to be no. There's no communist threat since the end of the Russian Civil War, and I doubt that they would really have a monarch war considering that they are one themselves. So there wouldn't be any Cold War happening. Charles III would die in 1954 and would be replaced with Charles IV. Decades would go by, and no wars would be happening. A new American peace has begun. As Charles IV dies, he gets replaced with Timothy Adams, who, fun fact, is a poker player right now in the world. He's a Canadian American. And this is the end of the scenario. Let me know what you think about it. Do you agree with my changes? Let me know in the comments below.